This is the Workplace Podcast with your host, William Corless. Brought to you in association with Yellowwood, your external learning and development partner. Each week we focus on a different aspect of the workplace. We hear from guest speakers who are subject matter experts and who are incredibly talented at what they do. These experts will give you a different perspective and insight to work life, with the aim of empowering you to take a different path to success in all aspects of work life. These perspectives will include career and personal success, leadership, high-performance teams, and creating a better work-life culture and organisation. Yellowwood, take a different path to success with your career, team, and organisation.
Welcome to the Workplace Podcast. Joining us today is Dr. Sandra Matz. Dr. Matz is an Associate Professor of Business at Columbia Business School in New York, where she also serves as the Director of the Center for Advanced Technology and Human Performance. As a computational social scientist with a background in psychology and computer science, she studies human behaviour and preferences using a combination of big data and analytics and traditional experimental methods. Her research uncovers the hidden relationships between our digital lives and our psychology, with the goal of helping businesses and individuals make better and more ethical decisions. Sandra's work is frequently covered in major news outlets, including The Economist, The New York Times, BBC, CNBC, The Wall Street Journal, The Guardian, Psychology Today, Scientific America, and many, many more. Dr. Sandra Matz, welcome to the Workplace Podcast.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
So I really enjoyed this book, and it really made me reflect on my use of technology. So for our listeners, this book is so insightful. It's about taking control of your data and shaping tech to benefit us all. So I'm just wondering, what led you to write this book, Sandra?
It's a funny story because I started writing without really a book in mind. So I was actually just writing these short stories for friends and family. Because as you said, first of all, I wanted them to care a little bit more about the research that I did than maybe they did before, right? Nobody reads academic papers. So I was like, maybe I can entice them to look into this a little bit more. But I also wanted them to care a bit more about their personal data and have a better understanding of here's how intimate your data really is. It's not just your GPS records. It's not just that you post something on social media, but those are really intimate insights into your psychology that you're creating. And that gives others quite a lot of control over your life. So it was really with the intention of, in this case, first getting my friends and family to care about the topic, and then now hopefully a few more people with the book.
It is so insightful. And the reason I found this interesting for our listeners of the Workplace Podcast is some of the skills of the future, which I think would be most valued. And there's a lot of research around this, is emotional intelligence, conflict resolution, and critical thinking. So a lot of this is actually combined in the book. So tell us, why is critical thinking so important when it comes to using technology?
Ideally, you think about the way that you generate data. When do you use it? Ideally, we'd all be reading the terms and conditions, right? And think about, is this a permission that I should be granting, or is this a permission that I shouldn't be granting? Now, in my opinion, and I think this changed quite a bit over the last 10 years, even if we are amazing at critical thinking and trying our best to manage our data, I don't think we stand a chance. So I've gotten quite a lot more pessimistic about, well, let's just educate people about what's possible with their data, and then they'll be able to figure it out. But technology moves so fast, right? So both keeping up with technology seems almost impossible. And then even if we did, it's still a full-time job. So even if you manage to think critically, hopefully you have better stuff to do than reading all of the terms and conditions, right? Maybe share a meal with your friends, maybe go out for a walk in the park, but don't spend your entire life critically thinking about whether you should be giving these permissions or not. So I think we probably need better solutions than just our ability to think critically. It's a great starting point, though.
So what I love about this book is he introduces this analogy of the digital village, and which I might get you to speak about later on. But this book is broken into three parts. Part one is the data into your psychology, and you talk about the big five. I think that's really important that we talk about that. And then part two is the bright and the dark sides of psychological targeting. So this is again back to the big five there, and then making data work for us at the very end. So this book really pulls back that curtain, helps us understand psychological profiling and the role of big tech. So just tell us about that, because when you talk about that psychological profiling, what is that like? Because that had come up with Cambridge Analytica before, people might remember, and Facebook and Meta got into trouble for that with one of the elections, or several elections, should I say?
Yeah, it's a great question, because oftentimes when we talk about AI and we talk about machine learning, right, it feels like this black box, and we don't really know how would anyone get from digital footprints to something like your personality. But at the end of the day, it's actually based on really, really simple relationships. So at the end of the day, we look at what is it that you do online? What are the words that you use in what you post on social media? What do you buy with your credit card? When do you buy it? Is there a certain routine? And how does that relate to, for example, whether you're impulsive or not? So I'm just going to give you a few examples that I think nicely show that it's not rocket science what we're doing, right? If you're, say, we take extroversion, which is one of the big 5 personality traits. So people are extroverted, they are social, they're outgoing, they seek stimulation. So those are the people that are usually out and about. So it's not surprising that when you look at what they post on social media, for example, they oftentimes post about what they do on the weekends, they post about being out with friends, they post about going to parties. When you look at their spending, they spend more money in pubs and bars than their introverted friends. So those are, I think, oftentimes relationships that are relatively obvious. And then if you look at introverts, they talk about reading, they talk about using the internet, so all of the things that you typically do by yourself. So some of the relationships that are underlying these predictive models are actually really, really simple. But what I love about this is that you also oftentimes discover a relationship that we might have just overlooked as humans. So my favorite one is the use of first-person pronouns. So I, me, myself. And I'm going to ask your listeners to just for a second think about what do you think is this could be related to, right? If you talk more about yourself, which psychological dimensions might be in the play here? I admit that when I was asked the same question, I thought it was narcissism. So I think I was like, well, if you talk about yourself, you just want other people to pay attention, you want to be the center of attention, clearly it's going to be narcissism. Turns out that it's actually emotional distress. So when you talk more about yourself, it's a sign of you potentially suffering from depression. And intuitively, I remember the first time I heard this, I didn't fully understand why. But then when you sit down for a second and think about what were you thinking the last time that you felt really sad and depressed and blue? It was probably not how to solve the world's problems, right? You were not thinking about climate change. You were not thinking about nuclear power. What you were thinking is like, why am I feeling so bad? Am I ever going to get better? What can I do to get better? So this inner monologue that we have just creeps into the language that we use. So for me, the psychological profiling is really a combination of something that we could all intuit as humans just by observing behavior, but also something that exclusively machines can do just because they can process so much more data at the same time, right? They can observe the behavior of millions of people at the same time, connected to their psychology, and then just kind of come up with these breadcrumbs that we might have missed. So that for me is the psychological profiling part.
And that's so interesting, as well as how the psychological profiling works for people, and they were able to market or identify certain people then that will want certain products or services. So with that in mind, I just want to go back a step or two, that we introduced the ocean model, and some of our listeners may not be aware of that. So the ocean model is openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. Isn't that right?
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
Those 5.
Could you just explain that ocean model then, just simply for our listeners?
Yeah, very happy to. It's also called the Big 5. So essentially has
Yeah.
these 5 traits. And it's interesting because the way that the Big 5 were developed was actually looking at language. So it used to be there were 2 psychologists that went through the entire English dictionary and pulled out all of the adjectives describing people. So assertive, nice, kind, curious. And then they just gave people a question and said, like, well, how much does each of these adjectives apply to you? And then based on the answers, they were actually finding that, well, some of them cluster together, right? If you say that you're assertive, maybe you're also more dominant, maybe you also kind of describe yourself in terms of all of these leadership agentic traits. So that's how the Big 5 were originally developed based on language. And the way that we psychologists think about them is that they're these very pragmatic dimension describing differences in the way that we think, feel, and behave. So I always think of it, if you meet a stranger in the street and you don't know anything about them, just having an understanding of their Big Five profile gives you a sense of how they're most likely to behave across different situations, right? The moment that you get to know them better, and we oftentimes throw the Big Five out of the window, right? You don't necessarily think about your spouse in terms of the Big Five because you have a much more nuanced understanding. But so those are the 5 dimensions, and they really capture everything from, like openness is the one that looks at how interested in aesthetics and how curious are you about the world, how open are you to new experiences, versus more traditional conservative. That one is oftentimes related to politics. Conscientiousness is sometimes described as a German trait, how, and I should say this does not apply to me at all, unfortunately, but how organized, dependable, reliable are you, versus how flexible to life, I would say, to put it in a nice way. Extroversion, I think, is the one that we relate to naturally because we use it in everyday language. So how much do you enjoy company? How much do you thrive in social situations? Agreeableness is the one that talks about our social relationships. So how trusting are we? How caring are we? How empathetic? And then neuroticism talks about essentially our ability to regulate emotions. So how emotionally stable are we? How easily stressed are we? So it really captures pretty much all of the human experience, if you want.
And then this is where they can capture data about people who might be impulsive or depressed or whatever, and we can be easily swayed. Then different adverts then could target different people from the same company.
Yeah, so this is exactly. So once you understand you can think of it, I always think of it as like, once you understand the Big Five, you learn something about people's motivations, their preferences, their fears, their hopes. And then by understanding where they're coming from, you can also try to push them in a certain direction that you want them to go in, right? So you think of the typical car salesperson. They're trying to figure out, okay, why do they want to buy the car? Maybe I can push some of the buttons. Maybe they're just worried that they're not going to get the good deal, so I'm going to push that one through. So they try and figure out who's on the other side and then adjust their sales pitch accordingly. And the same is true for psychological targeting. We try and figure out what's driving your behavior, and then you could either say exploit it or use it to change your behavior in a certain way.
Yeah. Okay. So with that in mind, then what I found fascinating then was another model that you introduced, or a framework, should I say, is the diamonds framework. I thought that was really good for our listeners. Could you break that down first? Because I think if people read this book, they would get you really pull back the curtains on how tech works, especially psychological profile, and I found it fascinating. So that diamonds framework.
I'll get to the diamonds framework in a second, because I think there's something fundamental about personality that gets us to the diamonds framework. So far, the way that I've described personality is it's very static, right? So I get a sense of maybe you're more extroverted or more introverted, more open-minded or more traditional, but it's a one-time measure. So once I know your profile, that's the profile. But I think our experience tells us that we're a lot more nuanced and dynamic, right? We don't always think of ourselves the same way. We don't always act in the same way. So there's always been this battle between personality psychologists who were kind of forcing this like relatively static view on personality. And then you had all of the social psychologists who said, forget about personality. It's all about the situation. Put 2 different people in the same situation. That's going to dictate behavior, right? So those are the experiments with Pavlov, where the dog is salivating once you ring a bell. Now, the way that we think about personality right now is almost a combination of the 2. So we think about it as somewhat static. So we all have a certain tendency to behave in a certain way, but we also acknowledge that we behave differently given the situation. So instead of saying, I'm just going to measure your extroversion level once, for example, we could say, hey, I'm going to now ask you 100 times over the course of 4 weeks, how extroverted do you feel right now? And what I would get is a distribution of what we call extroversion states. Usually it's like relatively normally distributed, right? Most of the time you're hovering somewhere around your average. And you can think of that average as actually the personality trait, right? That's your tendency. That's, in the absence of knowing anything about the situation, that's what I'm going to go for. But I also know that, let's say, and this is research that I've actually done myself, is if I put you in different places, I can play around, I can move your extroversion up and down a little bit. So if I put you in a coffee shop with other people, you're probably going to feel more extroverted than usual. If I put you at home or I put you in the library, where there's very little room for social interactions, right, you're probably going to shift more towards the introverted level. So that's a way in which we can now think of personality in both like static and dynamic terms. Now, the Diamonds framework is essentially a personality profile for situations. So instead of having to say, well, you're currently in a coffee shop and there's a lot of people, that's very idiosyncratic, right? So every situation has their own features, but we could say, well, it's a social situation. It's something that lends itself for mating. That's one of the dimensions. And so there we kind of again, like the same way we're losing some of the complexity of situations because we're breaking it down to these dimensions, but we're gaining something that we can compare across situations. So we can now say, well, coffee shops are really social and high on these ones, but then if you go to the library, has different features of different psychological dimensions of the situation. And the more we know about both you and the situation, the better we can actually zoom in and say, okay, right now, he's generally very extroverted, but right now he's in a social situation that lends itself to mating again. I'm sure he's going to be higher up on this extroversion and distribution of his than he typically is. So maybe now is a great time to send him the extroverted ad, right? Because he's like fully in his extroversion mode. Maybe he's even more receptive than typical.
And that's what big data is doing, isn't it? That it's like collecting all this information on you, then it's comparing you against the social group in your area or culture or whatever, and it's that constant comparison. And then the Diamonds framework, is there? Does the D stands for anything else, or how does that break down the Diamonds framework?
Yeah. Oh, now you're testing my knowledge. Let me see. It is the same as the Big Five. So D is for duty. I is for intellect. M is for mating. O is actually it's cheating because it's positivity. N is for negativity. S is for social. And now we're just missing the A. We'll have to get back to this.
That's okay. That's okay. And I actually found that fascinating then, because this is where, when we combine all this together, the diamonds and the ocean model, and then we talk about all the sources of data that we have. So we talk about smartwatches and then we talk about mental health then, and we talk about extroversion then. And this is where or tracking the GPS then, and tell us a little bit about that, because I found this fascinating. So if you have, they can figure out if you're depressed because it's that little movement that you're doing, that you're more likely to be depressed if you don't do that. Isn't that right?
Yeah. I can give you examples for specifically for depression, but I think you're absolutely right. It's not trivial to understand how do we get from a framework like the Diamonds, where we can describe situations, to tracking those dimensions with data. Right? So I think it makes somewhat sense to say, well, I'm going to take someone's historical social media posts, for example, and I infer whether they're more extroverted or introverted. Having something that's in the moment, right, a situation that's fleeting and that's gone in the next 10 minutes requires you to capture data in real time. So that could be anything from your phone, right? You carry your phone with you pretty much 24/7. And it's equipped with an armada of sensors. They were not necessarily put there to track your livelihood and your psychology, but it means that I have a microphone, so I can tap into the conversation around you, right? So I can see, well, are you probably in a lively spot because there's a lot of ambient noise, there's people chattering around you. So that gives me a sense of like the social of the situation. I can get a sense from your GPS location where you are. And then if I can map that against Google, also what happens there, right? So if I see that you're at the yoga studio somewhere in Manhattan and there's a yoga class happening right now, I probably have a good sense that that's what you're currently doing. So I would probably score it higher on duty, for example. Or you're hanging out in the library or attending a lecture, maybe that gives you an intellect. So there's essentially these traces that we capture dynamically that can tell us a lot about situations. Now, the study that you were referring to when it comes to mental health and depression, I think is a really interesting one, because depression is one of these mental health diseases it's extremely prevalent, right? And the problem is once you enter a full depressive episode, it's really hard to get out, because you're so inward focused that oftentimes you don't get the help, you don't reach out to the people that you should be reaching out to. So it's really hard to treat, just because oftentimes it goes undiagnosed and then it's too late. So what we can do with smartphones is we can essentially see, are there some deviations from your typical behavioral profile, right? That could be anything from you're not leaving your house as much anymore. And we know
Yeah.
that because we can look at your GPS records, and wherever your phone is at home, stationary at night, that's probably where you live. So we can just see how often do you leave that place. We can see how much physical activity is there. If there's a decrease, that's again a sign that you might be suffering from depression. And we can tap into your phone logs and see, well, maybe you're not making and taking as many calls anymore. So there's a reduction of like the social interactions that you typically have. And again, it's not a diagnostic tool. So it could be that you're just on vacation and that's why your behavioral pattern looks different. But we could have an early warning system that just pops up a flag and says, hey, seems like something is off. Why don't you look into this?
And that's where I think you paint a pretty much a scary picture, if I'm honest, of our digitally enhanced landscape. So it seems like Big Brother is out there. Now, I'm going to give you a very good example. So I was in America a couple of weeks ago, okay? And I had to apply for an ESTA visa for entry into the USA. And when I went there, I was asked for my social media profile. And now you link that into all these body cams for facial recognition or home automation systems like Alexa and Google Nest, these smartphone sensors, even car data has been tracked. I saw something on TV where they were trying to find someone who committed a crime and it was actually something hidden in their car. Our digital breadcrumbs are everywhere,
Yeah.
so it seems like we're helpless in this, or is there something that we can do with cookie trackers or something like that? Like why bother?
Yeah, I think it's a great point, right? You can think of it, the creepy version that I always have in my mind is that it take even your phone, right? Is someone looking over your shoulder, walking with you 24/7? If that happened in the offline world, if there was someone looking over your shoulder, tracking your every move, that person
Yeah.
would be in prison in no time, right? And yet this is like, there's many companies who have access to their data now because it's like very easy to buy on the market. So it, as you said, there's a lot of aspects of that are extremely creepy. And it's not just the way that I think about it is not just the invasion of your privacy, right? It's not just that someone knows everything that you're doing. It's also that insight and that knowledge then allows people to just meddle with the choices that you make and the life that you live. And so for me, that's even like overstepping further because it's not just peeking into your psychology. It's also using your psychology to potentially get you to do stuff that you otherwise wouldn't, right? If I get you to buy something that you don't need, maybe I get you to vote for a certain candidate that you otherwise wouldn't have voted for. So that's a pretty big intrusion into both our privacy and our, if you want, agency and self-determination.
So while you were speaking there, I finally found the
The
diamonds
framework,
framework. Okay,
amazing.
because
Yeah.
you could see my eyes
I
moving
can see the
back and
wheels
forward.
turning.
Yeah. So when we talk about the average levels of agreement, it's duty, intellect, adversity, mating,
Adversity.
positivity, negativity, deception, and sociality. So with that in mind, then there are dark and bright sides of technology. Okay. So what are the dark sides and maybe what are the bright sides? So like from like a bright side, it might help with mental health, for example, or help you find the job that you really love, or it could help us how we spend money or whatever. There's dark sides and positive sides. So where we go to first? What are the dark sides first?
So the dark sides we've touched on a little bit. So for me, one of the dark sides is essentially invasion of privacy, right? And
Yeah.
there's always people who say, well, I don't care about my data being out there because I have nothing to hide. And
Yeah.
on some level, it's like a comment that I get in pretty much every class I teach on the ethics of data. And I, on some level, even understand the comment, right? It feels like an uphill battle and it feels like there's nothing we can do. So why not just give up if you don't
Yeah.
feel like you're too worried? The only thing is that it's a privileged position to be in, right? So not everybody has the privilege to say that. There's people worried about their data being out there because they're prosecuted for their religion, for their sexual orientation.
Yeah.
And it's also very fleeting because you don't know what's going to happen tomorrow, right? So data,
Yeah.
once it's generated, it's permanent, but
Yeah.
leadership isn't. And I think the US has experienced this in the context of the Supreme Court decision on Roe versus Wade, where suddenly overnight, like half the population, right, almost every woman in the US could have been worried about the fact that now their Google searches could be turned into an understanding of whether they might be pregnant or not, whether they might be looking for an abortion. Just visits to clinics are tracked by GPS records. So suddenly overnight, I think people who previously might have felt really privileged and not worried suddenly were worried about their data. So there's this notion that you don't care about your privacy, I think is a risky one. But it's not just that. So even if you say, okay, I don't care what happens tomorrow, I'm just gonna live in today, it means that again, you're not making your own choices and you're not living your own life. If someone passively, without you being aware, can make all of these inferences about you and then use those insights to change how you think about the world, how you feel, and the choices that you make, that means that suddenly you're losing your agency. And I think that's a much bigger problem that's very immediate and impacts everybody, whether you're worried about your data or not. So I think the dark side is a pretty clear front and center when you look at the media.
And just on that, before we move into the positive sides of things,
Yeah.
because facial recognition then, because this is something that's becoming bigger and bigger, where security or police should wear facial recognition body cams and stuff like that. Like, what are your thoughts on that?
It's not even just police, right? So there's like cameras everywhere. Like I remember London, there's like CCTV on every corner. In the US, there's like millions and millions of cameras. I remember at some point looking up whether you could get from downtown Manhattan to uptown Manhattan without being seen by a camera. And I think the only way that you could do this was to swim through the Hudson River. So there's just no way that you can leave your face at home, right? So there was always the argument, well, if you don't use social media, you can't be tracked there. If you don't use your phone, you can at least leave it at home. You don't need to use your credit card, as the mafia can attest. But once we're being tracked by our face, it's a whole new story, because we know that even if you wear a mask, it's still possible to predict who you are. And again, those are intimate predictions, because we know who do you meet, where do you go, what do you do.
And just an example of that, a recent one was the murder of the CEO, the healthcare CEO of the insurance company a couple of weeks ago in New York. And within hours, they were able to track all of the movements in New York in that track, and then found later on in Pennsylvania. Okay, so the bright sides then. So that was the dark side. Okay,
Yeah.
what are the bright sides then, Sandra?
Yeah, I do think so. I've actually spent quite a lot of time trying to come up with some of the bright sides and show that same technology can be used in two ways. There's actually a quote that I really like by the tech historian Melvin Kranzberg, who said, technology is neither good nor bad, but it's also not neutral. And I really like this last part, because if it's not neutral, it's essentially up to us. So I've spent quite a lot of time trying to figure out not only how do we get it right, but what are some of the positive use cases. And I've started doing that in what if scenarios. So essentially for every potentially nefarious use case, I'm trying to see, can we do exactly the opposite? So simplest example would be, if I can tap into your psychology and sell you more stuff that maybe you don't need, can I also use it to help you save more? So this is one of the first studies that we did in this space, where we said, saving is such a hard problem for the brain, right? Because you have to give up something in the here and now for something potential in the future. And we worked with a fintech company in the US that was trying to help people with very low levels of savings. So we work with people of less than $100 in savings. And that's an incredibly critical level, right? So the only thing that needs to happen is you need a medical bill that you can't cover, or your car needs to break down. Now you can't go to work, but you can't fix it. And then your life is over. So what we try to do is we try to, over the course of 4 weeks, encourage these people to save another $100. Again, might not sound that much to some of your listeners, but in this case, it meant doubling the savings for people. So this was a huge ask. And what we did is we just surveyed their personality. So again, in this case, it was very interactive. So it's not that we just passively said, we're going to profile you and then we're going to get you to do something that you don't want to do. But it was very open in terms of, hey, we're trying to figure out how we can help you save. Why don't you answer some of these questions? So we got their Big Five personality profile, and then we crafted messages that were tapping into the different psychological needs. So if you have someone who's agreeable, for example, who cares about their social relationships, you're not going to convince them to save just because they want more money in the bank account. So what we told them is like, why don't you put some money to decide right now so you can protect your loved ones now and in the future. And what we found is over this course of the 4 weeks, about 11% of the people that were in the study managed to hit that $100 savings goal. Now, clearly far from ideal, right? Ideally, we'd want to have 100% of people doing that. But again, it's a pretty big lift. And importantly, it was more successful, 60% more successful than the gold standard message that Save a Life, the company, had been using up to this point. So they had already been trying for years, right? Optimizing how do you encourage people to save money. And yet still by tapping into people's psychology, we were 60% more effective at getting people to save. So I think that was a nice initial use case. There's so many other ones, right? If you think about like mental health, back in 2015, Facebook made the news by essentially predicting whether teenagers were suffering from depression, self-doubt, anxiety, and then selling them out to advertisers for profit. So this is clearly a nefarious purpose. But then, as we talked about earlier, if you can understand whether teenagers might be suffering from anxiety, could be an incredible opportunity, right? Because if you can then just see, okay, here's something that we can do early on to get them the help that they need. Maybe there's even ways in which you can say, if you know that someone is suffering from depression more often, they could nominate a loved one to say, hey, I know that there might be points in my life where I'm going to slide into depression really quickly, and I might not be able to get out of this myself, or as I'm on the slide, reach out to people who could help me. But I can nominate you here and now. And if something happens, you're just going to get a message, right? And again, might be nothing, but why don't you then reach out to me and see if I need anything? So there's all of this potential to really counter pretty much every negative use case that you can think of.
What a wonderful way to look at that. And speaking of teenagers, then this brings me to mind of, I think I read it first in Malcolm Gladwell book, which one I don't know, but that case of the targeted advertising with the retail giant Target, the teenage girl. Can you tell our listeners about that?
Yeah, it's the I think it's one of the most famous stories, the notorious Target story, where Target sent ads for pregnancy products to a teenage girl, and the dad shows up at Target outraged, like, how could you send this to my daughter? Da 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 da. Fast forward, turns out that she was actually pregnant, and the models had picked up on that through the stuff that she'd been going through. So without actually her knowing or her dad knowing at the time. So it's like this idea that, again, once we have access to your entire digital identity, there's things we can know about you that you might not even know yourself at the time.
So this podcast is all about encouraging people to take a different path, right? So from a personal leadership point of view, or even if you're a position of power, and we talk about ethics there. This is where you quoted the 5 moral values, which are innate and universal, by Jonathan Haidt. Sorry if I pronounced that correctly. Can you just go through those 5 moral values?
So Jonathan Haidt is well, you can think of it actually as the big 5 for like your moral landscape, right? So how do we make decisions about what is right or wrong in the world? And 5 moral values are care, fairness, loyalty, authority, and purity. And what we know is that essentially there's differences when it comes to political ideologies, for example. So liberals typically tend to favor fairness and care when they decide what is right or wrong. Like, just take immigration, right? So you can think about, well, we need to take care of the people who come into this country, and it's only fair if they also get a shot at making it here. And then you have something like loyalty, tradition, and purity that are bigger among conservatives. If those are the dimensions that guide your moral compass, it also makes sense that you think about the world differently, right? Because then loyalty is first and foremost to your community. So that means thinking about immigration, it's a threat to your local community, so you might be more likely to be opposed. Tradition means we just want to have business as usual. We don't want anything to change, which oftentimes obviously is the case with immigration. So moral foundations in a way is, again, like similar to the big 5, just in a very specific space.
So with that in mind then, is this notion that I liked as well, that I read about, is moral reframing. Can you just tell us about that concept? I fell in love with that.
Yeah, I also think it's I think of it as a special case of psychological targeting. So if psychological targeting essentially means tapping into psychology to change your behavior or your attitudes, moral reframing does that in the context of, again, your moral values. And the idea here is that if I can, for example, make a political argument in a way that speaks to your moral foundations rather than mine, it's going to be much more persuasive. And typically, right, so if I'm a liberal, most of the arguments that liberals make about immigration are liberal arguments. So it's, again, tapping into care and fairness, even when we're trying to convince someone who's conservative, because that's our view on the world, right? And we only have this one perspective, but it's like an egocentrism bias that just says, I'm going to try to explain to you how I see the world, and I'm going to try to persuade you using my own view on the world. It's much more effective if I take it and say, I'm going to try and figure out how you think about the world. Right? If you're conservative, can I craft an argument about climate change that's based on purity, for example, like preserving the planet rather than saying we want to look out for generations in the future, which again is a much more liberal argument. And what we know is that it's people are much more open and receptive to arguments, even to a point that goes against their original beliefs, if it's made within their own moral foundation. So again, we're just tapping into how do you see the world, and can we use that to explain something to you or to convince you of a certain argument. So very similar to other forms of psychological targeting, just in the moral domain.
And that's what I like. I study conflict resolution a lot. Isn't that a wonderful way to use technology for the good then? And then that can be used by social media companies or whatever, that we could actually inform people, well, here's a different viewpoint.
Yeah.
So you're not stuck into an echo chamber. That's what I really took from the book, that, you know, we could say, listen, let's go to a different social media platform that will encourage us to look at different points of view in a way that's more digestible, or we can be receptive to.
Yeah, it's actually it's one of my favorite what if examples, in a way, because I think when we talk about psychological targeting, personalization, it's typically we're just going to make our perspective on the world narrower, right? I know that you're extroverted now. I'm going to cater to your extroverted preferences, and that not only makes you somewhat boring and unidimensional, but it also means that we kind of have less and less of this shared reality where we see the same things. But you could use exactly the same algorithm to kind of let me see what the world of someone else looks like, right? So Facebook knows exactly what, let's say, like the life of the 50-year-old farmer in Ohio looks like, that I would never get to see, right? There's no way that I can actually step into their shoes unless there's someone who knows exactly what their newsfeed looks exactly what they see when they search for something on Google. And then again, what you were just saying is the worst case, such a machine would just create reactance, right? If I see their reality and I don't like what I'm seeing, I might dig in my heels even deeper. But if there was a way of having an AI assistant almost step into that echo chamber with us and say, okay, here's maybe why they're seeing this. Just kind of consider their entire life. Here's their history. Here's how they got here. Here's why they might kind of think about immigration in a way that you don't think about because it's impacting their family. And here, someone lost their job. So this could be really used to help us understand where someone is coming. Even it doesn't necessarily mean that we have to agree, but it would at least open up avenues for us to see the world in a different way.
And doesn't that give us great hope in an age of polarization, especially political polarization, or we talk about different aspects like climate, that we can actually see different viewpoints then and move on. Now, speaking of moving on then, this is something that I was like, oh my, I have to tell the listeners about this one. So the spider bot. Tell us about the spider bot.
Yeah, the spider bot is really, really pretty cool. And this is in the context of, it's a pretty big jump now from moral reframing, but it's in the context of precision medicine. And so the idea that very similar to targeted advertising, right? Targeted advertising, the goal is to get the right message to the right customer at the right time, Precision medicine says, can we get the right treatment to the right person at the right time through the right channels? And for that, like the beginning is essentially monitoring in real time. And so the spider bot that you're talking about is, it's not science fiction, it's actually science. So this is a paper published a couple of years ago by someone in Japan, where they have I'm not sure if it's a bacteria or a virus, but it's essentially something in your bloodstream that's made up of organic material, right? So it's actually inherent to your body, and it just has like this little skeleton. So it has 6 legs that help it move through your body, and it detects cancer cells. So it's powered by the oxygen in your blood, and it kind of makes it move through your body and continuously scan your body for cancer cells, which then means once it finds it, right, we kind of know exactly where the location is. It's much easier. And we also kind of get it in real time. So you don't have to wait to stage 3 until a doctor kind of finally finds that cancer. So this is one way in which I think that the monitoring of our data is actually used for good.
So if people are interested in that, that is Park's Spiderbot, and it's on page 120 of this book. I was like, oh, wait till you hear this. This is brilliant. And then this is where an aspect we talk about mental health and medical, where AI chatbots and therapists might be shrinking. I could be replaced. Can you tell us a little bit about, the AI chatbot then when it comes to mental health?
I think another opportunity for like a positive use case, right? So I think we've seen this during COVID. So COVID was the first time that a lot more people turned to technology, right? So you couldn't leave your house, you couldn't get to a traditional therapist. So a lot of people turned to these chatbots, and now that it's been an evolution. They've been around for a while. Initially, they were relatively simple. So it was just based on like a decision-making tree. If you ask this question, we're going to give you this answer and make this suggestion. Now with generative AI, you can obviously have a natural conversation with a bot. And they're incredibly good at digesting, let's say, scientific literature on here's how you treat PTSD. So you can feed it a manual, and it does an incredible job figuring out how to go through this. Now, there's, I think, a lot of potential, first of all, because of access issues, right? So there's for every 100,000 people looking for a therapist, there's exactly 13 trained professionals. So there's a huge gap in terms of supply and demand. And then you can imagine that this gap widens in certain parts of the world and closes in others, right? If you live on the Upper East Side in New York, you're probably not going to have a problem finding a therapist. But if you live in other parts of the world, you might not have one available at all, let alone one that you can afford, right? It's just extremely expensive going to a human therapist. And even if you can, so there's a lot of potential to just help people who otherwise can't get access to a normal one. But I think even for people who see one in blood and flesh, there's a lot of opportunities, because what typically happens with a blood and flesh therapist, right? You see them maybe once a week, maybe once every 2 weeks, which means that everything that you discuss is like a hindsight. It's like, okay, here's what happened during the week. Walk me through. How did you react? But we know that it's very difficult or almost impossible to relive feelings the way that we felt them in the moment. So you could imagine if you also had your chatbot, like the moment that you have this argument with your spouse, you can have that experience. You can share that experience with a bot. You can go through while emotions are still hot. And then you can take that to your therapist and say, okay, here's how I felt in the moment. Let's dissect it together and let's see how we can move forward. So I think there's just a lot of opportunities there in terms of giving access to mental health. Now, clearly not without drawbacks, right? So those models are never perfect. And I think especially in the beginning, there were a lot of mistakes that these models made that were just absolutely terrifying. So someone like a child complaining about sexual abuse and the bot just celebrating positive social relationships, or someone asking for, or like saying that they wanted to jump off a bridge to kill themselves and the bot just recommending the closest bridge. I think we're getting closer to having better guardrails in place, but still it's not without drawbacks. Huge opportunity, but certainly a context where you want to get it as close to perfect as you can.
And that's where it's never really going to replace the human connection, really, isn't it? Because it's that sense of belonging, that oxytocin that we have by somebody truly listening. So I think for therapists out there, is to be reassured you are not going to be replaced. I think it's, and I've had this, if I'm honest, where I've had coaching clients that really were struggling at the time, and they actually used ChatGPT to put in questions that I would normally they think I would ask. And it's because of access, isn't it? If there are people are struggling, that to say, listen, if it's midnight and I can't sleep and I really want to talk to someone or get reassurance on something. So it's a bit like it's more of a first aid to reassure people on that.
I think so too. Even though, I mean, one of the fascinating things is that I think people do build relationships with AI agents, right? So there's all of these stories where people fall in love with
Yeah,
bots. There was a recent really tragic story that was covered by Laurie Siegel, who's a tech reporter formerly at CNN, and which I thought was fascinating. It's essentially this teenager that fell in love with an AI agent and then ended up killing himself because he wanted to be with her. So I do think that there's like this beginningly blur, like this blurred line between what's a real relationship between human and human versus
yeah,
relationship with these AI bots, which is another new level. Can be incredibly helpful for people who are lonely and just need someone to
yeah.
talk to, but can also be incredibly dangerous when we're losing control.
So that brings to mind then of let's go back then to data then, okay? And
Mm-hmm.
in the book you mentioned this data is the new oil, and we have data
Hmm.
centers popping up everywhere. They're increasing numbers, especially with AI. So tell me more. Why is data the new oil?
Yeah, I mean, I think from everything that we've talked about, it just kind of gives you control, right? So data means that you understand people, and an understanding of people has always been valuable. Whether that's your customers, whether that's your employees, whether it's your spouse, I would argue just understanding where someone is coming from and where someone wants to go to, just gives you a lot of power, right? In the context of our online lives, it oftentimes means attention. If I understand you, I can keep you on the platform for longer. I can show you more ads, and that is how companies make money.
So before this podcast started recording, I shared an example, a
Yeah.
situation where I was in Philadelphia last week in Wharton, and I was in a masterclass, and the masterclass was on maintaining your competitive advantage in an AI era. And essentially, what I got was that to maintain that, which made me recoil a little bit, is how you create your
Mm-hmm.
competitive advantage is making it hard for your customer to leave you. And the phrase that really irked me was the phrase owning the customer. Now, at the time, there was also mocking of Europe and our privacy laws and cookies. And have you used, a website asking all these cookies? And, it's impossible. And there was a lot of mocking going on. So I felt I should take a stance on this. So in front of 300 people, I promoted your book and I
Yeah.
stated I was Irish, European, a big fan of GDPR. And then I highlighted that there is a Californian version of that as a geopolitical risk. And the amount of people
Yeah.
asking me, um, about your book was brilliant. But just tell me about that, because self determination is key. You mentioned
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
agency as well. This is really important, where we take back control.
Yeah, I think it's a extremely short-sighted view on
Mm,
business, right? So ideally, you make it hard for your customers to leave because you're providing such an incredible service that they don't want to go anywhere else. And I think especially now, well, first of all, as you said, the regulatory landscape is changing. So the idea that you just own your customer and you force them to stay, like the moment regulation changes and they're free to go and it's like much easier for them and you have a harder time adjusting, they're going to be gone, right? So if you don't offer great service, you just make it hard for people to leave. The moment that they have the opportunity to do so, they're going to be out the doors. The same in companies, right? You can force your employees to do something. The moment that you step aside and you can't be there to surveil them all the time, they're going to be gone. So you better motivate them to stay by offering a service that's so exceptional that they actually want to stay there. And it's interesting because we do see pretty big companies doing that in the data space, right? If you look at Apple is one of these companies that is essentially marketing the fact that they care about their privacy. So if about your privacy, if you walk through New York, you kind of see all of the ads for Apple. It's all about how Apple protects your privacy much more so than Android, which is actually true, by the way. So Apple phones are much better at not tracking your data continuously than Android. So they make it part of their value proposition, instead of saying, well, we're just going to try to force you and we're going to collect as much data as possible. And I think it's a much smarter approach because it's much more adaptable, right, to new regulation, which I think will be coming in most parts of the world. And what is interesting about GDPR is the big tech companies they don't want to distinguish, is this a European user? Is this not a European user? So oftentimes they actually adhere to the strictest regulations around the world just because it's such a hassle to do this at an individual level. So for me, I think the approach of owning your customer is not only morally, I think, wrong, but also what we know from research. So there's research showing that if you give people control and you give them agency, they're actually much more likely to engage with your product. So this idea that I kind of see that a service cares about me and gives me choice in how I use it and what I do amplifies engagement instead of taking it away. So I do think this owning part is a very short-sighted, outdated approach to business. And I think it's going to die relatively soon.
So that brings me to the point of privacy by design. So when we
Yeah.
talk about self-determined and agency, what's privacy by design then?
Yeah, it's an approach that tries to make it as easy for people as possible to do the right thing, right? So we all lazy people, let's admit it. Like we only have so much time in a day. There's no way that if I have to opt out of all of the tracking from all of the services and products that I'm using, it's never going to happen because I don't have the time to sit down and go through terms and conditions, opt out of every single service. That just makes it incredibly hard for us to do the right thing. Privacy by design would say, we're going to switch this to opt-in, for example. So by design, your privacy is protected. And now, obviously, you can change it, right? But the default is your privacy is protected, and now you have to actively opt in. And there's always this argument, well, then companies are not getting enough data. It's a kind of related to your previous point, right? Because the companies that show me that they're actually doing a good job with my data and they're turning data into something that's valuable for me, they're still going to get my data. It's the companies that just have lip service and say, well, we're going to use your data, but don't provide anything in return. They're the ones that are going to lose out. It's the ones that try to force you to stay there by making it hard for you to get out. Now, once we shift to something like privacy by design through regulation or just through norms in industry, those ones are going to be in trouble really soon.
So yeah, so it's voting with your feet or with your thumbs.
Yeah.
I might add. Okay,
Yeah.
so the concepts of federated learning and data co-ops, because I think this is where we come back, buy back control a little bit or take back control, should I say?
Yeah, those are two concepts that I care a lot about. And it's really coming from this idea that we can't do it alone, right? If it's just up to us and we have to make choices between, do I get convenience, service, better products, and personalization, but I have to give up my privacy? Most of us will give up privacy because it's like such an abstract concept. It's really hard if we want to use something to just say, no, maybe my data could be abused in the future. So if it's a choice, an either or choice, most of us are not going to make the best choice in terms of picking privacy and self-determination. So federated learning is actually a technology that tries to break down this dichotomy. And by saying, I don't need to collect all of your personal data to offer you personalization and service. And again, Apple, for example, and Google too, are two leading players in this field. So Apple, on your phone, when it's trying to train Siri, so trying to make sense of your voice and trying to learn how you speak and then respond, they don't necessarily, you don't need to send your speech data to a central server of Apple. So typically how machine learning models are trained is all of the data gets collected, we teach the model something, and then we distribute it again, and we now send it to your phone. What happens in federated learning is the speech data never leaves your phone. What happens instead is that Apple sends its intelligence to your phone because your phone is extremely powerful, right? So your phone is many, many, many times more powerful than the computers that we use to launch rockets into space with. So what we can do is Apple can send a model to your phone. Your data stays on the phone, so never leaves its safe harbor, but it updates the model. It helps Apple learn. It helps your speech recognition model get better, so it's easier for you to use Siri as an interface. And then what it does, so that we collectively benefit, it, instead of sending you data, it just sends back the intelligence. So it sends, oh, I figured out this pitch is related to this, and if he says this, maybe here's a part of an accent. Now we can also understand the way that he speaks, and that gets sent back to Apple, but never your original data. And you, like, I mean, Siri is one example. Think about this in the medical space, right? We could cure and understand diseases much better if we were all to pool our genetic data, medical histories, biometric data, lifestyle data. But I don't want this super sensitive data to sit in a central server. But what we could do is we could set up these structures, and that's going to get me to data co-ops in a second, that actually say, I'm going to keep my genetic data, but I allow other people, companies, entities, startups, to ask questions of my data. If they want to understand a certain disease, they can ask questions about my data, and I'm going to send back the intelligence, but I'm not going to send them my data. That's federated learning. Now, data co-ops are essentially, it's a data governance structure that really empowers people to have a group, like a support system. That's how I think about it. So it's really hard for me to manage my data, and my own data is also not that valuable. But if I only use my genetic data and my medical history to understand a certain disease, I'm not going to get far because I don't have a comparison. I don't have like different versions. But if like, let's say we get people together who have a shared interest. My go-to example these days is expecting moms. You want to know, what should I do during pregnancy to make sure I'm healthy and to make sure the baby's healthy, given my, again, genetics, medical history, lifestyle, age, and so on and so forth. And what we could do is we could kind of have a data co-op. So that's an entity that's owned by its members. So all of the pregnant ladies now own this entity, and we pool our data. And because it's many of us, we can now hire experts that help us make the most of it, right? So experts who can set up, for example, the infrastructures for federated learning, so we don't have to send our data, who can decide if a pharma company approaches us, is this actually one that we should be trusting? For what purposes? Maybe we set it up again, such that we don't send the data, but we share intelligence. And then they can also share insights with us directly. So there's one in Switzerland that's called My Data, for example, which does the same thing for MS patients. So pooling data from MS patients, which is a disease that's really poorly understood. And it's determined by so many factors that it's really difficult to figure out how to treat each person. So what they do is they collect, as a data co-op, data from patients, data from non-patients. They first of all learn something about the disease, but then they also, for each patient that's part of the co-op, they connect with a doctor in the hospital and say, okay, here's like what we would recommend based on all of the data that we're seeing for patient X. Now you try, as a doctor, you decide what you want to do in the end, but give us feedback on what worked and what didn't work. So every person, every member of the co-op actually benefits directly. In the same way that we have banks, for example, with fiduciary responsibilities, true for the data co-op as well, right? So the data co-op is legally obligated to act in the best interest of its members. And for me, that's a totally different game. So it goes beyond regulation, because it's not just trying to mitigate risk, it's really trying to help every person maximize the utility that they can get from their data.
That is so insightful for our listeners, and this is what we're trying to, I suppose, achieve in this podcast, is to demonstrate that digital leadership where we're making data and technology a force for good. Sandra, if people were to find out more about you, your book, and what you do, how might they do so?
Yeah, so the book actually has a website, and mindmasters.ai. And then we also, together with my husband, we recently set up this Center for Advanced Technology and Human Performance. So it's human-performance.ai. I think we try to collect a whole bunch of studies, ideas, discussions there that all touch on the topic.
Sandra Matz, thank you so much for joining the Workplace Podcast.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for listening to the Workplace Podcast with your host, William Corless. Our special thanks to this episode's guest for sharing their expertise with us. If you found this episode valuable, please rate and review it. For updates on future episodes and to get in contact with us about any workplace topics, please follow Yellowwood on LinkedIn and Twitter at Different Paths. As always, you can head over to yellowwood.ie for any other information. Yellowwood, your external learning and development partner, provider of executive coaching, facilitation, and training. Take a different path to success with your career, leadership, team, and organization.